Here in Hebrews chapter 7. We just started it last week we got through the first two verses, which I'm going to just review briefly. Let me get to the actual text here on my screen. Come on. There we go. Hebrews chapter 7. In this chapter, remember we started this discussion back in chapter 5. And then the Hebrew writer, said to his audience that he didn't think that they could understand this or handle this. And so he took all of chapter 6 talking about the danger of falling away and really the anchor that we have that is in Jesus Christ. And he ends up at the chapter saying, quoting Psalm 110 verse 4 again, saying that Jesus Christ, you are forever a priest you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So he ends up the chapter 6 where he wanted to be at chapter 5, and he's gone through. And now in chapter 7, we get a wealth of information about this guy named Melchizedek. And we're probably going to spend not the bulk of our time on verse 3, but quite a bit of time on verse 3 because it's kind of controversial. And but let's get back into the text. I'll read the first 3 verses here. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy. Some of your versions may say without descent, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. And so it's interesting if you look at, as we go through this, there's a wealth of information here. All that's mentioned in the Old Testament about this Melchizedek, he wants to, all that's mentioned is in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, which is on the screen there, and Psalm 110, verse 4. And so out of all of that, we get very scant information about this man named Melchizedek, or this being named Melchizedek. We'll call it that for right now. A lot, if you go Google who is Melchizedek, you'll get a lot of suppositions about who he is and just what the significance of it. There's a great significance. And that has to do with Jesus Christ. And it has to do with Jesus Christ as high priest. And that's what we're going to concentrate on. In fact, that's what the author wants to show. The author is now trying to get back to hand. He's already mentioned, and I've got it down later, he's already mentioned a number of times that Jesus Christ is high priest. And to the Jews, this is just not heard of, because we'll look later on at some of those verses, but the Jew knows that the high priest comes out of the tribe of Levi. And not only does the high priest supposed to come out of the tribe of Levi, he's supposed to be a descendant of Aaron. And so the high priest actually has a pedigree, just like an AKC dog has a pedigree, telling you who their mother was and who their father was and who their grandfather was and who their grandmother was. All of that information, the high priest did the same exact thing. Because it was a hereditary office. In fact, there were requirements for a priest. Levites could marry just about anyone, but a priest had to marry a virgin, and that was so that there wasn't any question about the parentage of the children. Just like when Charles married Diana, that was a big deal that she was a virgin. Talking about Charles, the prince in England, and Princess Diana. That was a big deal. And because she was expected to carry children that would be in the royal line. And they don't want any question. Of course, now they have DNA tests and all of that. But that doesn't change the way that the Jews were doing their lineage and doing their requirements and all of that. So we get back to the subject at hand. The author wants to show us that Jesus is high priest, and he wants to show that his priesthood is superior to that of Aaron's. And he's going to do that in this chapter. It's important that we understand that Jesus Christ is a superior high priest. In fact, the second paragraph is going to make that pretty clear as to why it's necessary. So the verse 7 says, "For this Melchizedek," and again, I've got on the screen here. Let's read Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High, of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, 'Blessed be Abraham, of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand.' And he gave him a tithe of all." And so this minor little passage here in Genesis, if you go back to Genesis chapter 13, what you find is that, let me put this map up here, the blue line at the upper right represents 5 kings that came down out of the north, the king of Shinar, and they've got some really bizarre names, and for the time, I'm sure they were quite common, but you can go back and look at Genesis chapter 14. They came down, and you can see that they swung down to the bottom of the nation there, the land there, and they came back up through. And when they did that, they attacked Sodom, they attacked Gomorrah, they attacked a number of places. But one of the things they did when they attacked Sodom is that they captured Lot, who was Abram's nephew. And then they took a lot of treasure and booty, and they went making their way back up. Now in the middle of the screen, you can see it says the name Abraham there, and I think I can kind of point that out with my mouse. I can. Abraham lives in this area here. He lives anywhere near Hebron, up here near Mamre. You can see both Hebron here and Mamre. He gathers his own army, his friends that live in Mamre, and he takes his own household, and which is 300 and some men, and he follows up, and you can see the line following up here, and he follows up, and he divides his army, and they attack a much larger army, and they completely defeat them, and they come back down. Now, as you can see, Bethlehem and Jerusalem and Mamre and Hebron, they're all in the same geographic area, within about 20 miles of each other here, or even less. And so you might think this is just an odd thing right in the middle of this passage, that Abraham's coming home, or Abram as he's called at this point in time. I'm sorry, I was looking off at the map. Abram's coming home, and he just stops at Jerusalem, and Melchizedek comes out and blesses him. And that's where we are. Abram's coming back. He's got the spoils, and he's coming back through the way that he normally would probably come down on the west side of the land of Canaan, and he stops at Jerusalem. Oops, went too far. Stops at Jerusalem, and that's where we get this passage here where Melchizedek comes out, brought out bread and wine, and it says that he was the priest of God Most High. Now, Abraham is a follower of God Most High. Abraham, or Abram as he's called right now, doesn't know the name Jehovah yet. That hasn't been announced yet. All that he knows is that this is the God of heaven and earth, and Melchizedek is his priest. And that's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But so this Melchizedek, besides this verse here in Genesis chapter 14 and the one in Psalm 110 verse 4, these are the only 2 mentions of him, and I have said that before. And as also mentioned, the Jews believe that Melchizedek is actually Shem, and I don't give any credence to that. They also think that the priesthood passed from Shem to Abraham because he blessed Abram first and then God second. And neither of those are biblical concepts. So I'm not sure where they get those kind of myths or whatever they're saying. It's certainly not biblical. But what we do see in this passage in Genesis is that Melchizedek is the priest of God Most High. And I believe this says something interesting here. First of all, there were others besides Abram that were aware of God and worshiped God. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, it says, as for Seth, to him also was born a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. So all along, and of course, we've gone through the flood, and we've got Noah and his family, and assumably they all believe in God and understand and know who God is. But from the Tower of Babylon, it appears that not only were languages confused, but that there were others that others began to develop other worship patterns and other gods. Abram was called out of that land near Babel. Ur of the Chaldees is down in the Fertile Crescent. I don't have it on a map or anything, but he was called up, and he came up to the top above Damascus, kind of where those kings were in Haran, and then he came down when God called him. But Abram is, sometimes I think we get the idea that he's the only one who knew who God was, but that's not the case. What we don't know, really, we get a couple of them here. Let me give you some examples. People that believed in God. I'm sure you can think of at least one, if not two, the two that I'm going to give you. But Balaam was one. Over in Exodus chapter, that's not what I want to read. Sorry, I don't have that on my screen. I'll leave that map up there. Exodus chapter 18, verses. That was Balaam. Balaam's actually over in Numbers 22. I'm getting ahead of myself. How about Jethro? Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, a priest of Midian, and in Exodus chapter 18, verses 10 through 12, if you want to look on your own, look it up in your own Bible. And Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in this very thing which they behaved proudly, he was above them." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So Jethro was apparently a believer in God. If you look at Job chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. So I think oftentimes we get this idea looking at the Old Testament that there weren't very many people who believed in God, who worshiped God. Why doesn't the Bible talk about them? Why does it concentrate on Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob? Well, there's a very good reason for that, and that is because the Bible is focused on Jesus Christ. And I can tell that I'm going to have an itchy nose again tonight. Sorry about that. The Bible is focused on Jesus Christ. So whether or not other men believed in God and followed after God is really not important to the discussion of trying to get to Jesus Christ, because that's what the Old Testament does. It's trying to get to Jesus Christ. It points to I often draw a timeline with a cross in one spot and an arrow pointing to Jesus Christ. The whole Old Testament really just points to Jesus Christ. And so if we were to talk about all of human history, the Bible would have so much information in it, that story might get lost. And so what God has done in the Old Testament, he doesn't often talk about others who believe in him, but he's concentrating on the land or on the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so that's why we have Abraham. That's why Moses is mentioned and Jethro is mentioned. Job is mentioned for a far different reason, but mainly to talk about that good people can suffer. But there were other men who believed in God, and Melchizedek was one of those. He was not a Jew. He was most likely a Canaanite. He was living in the land of Canaan. He was a king of a Canaanitish city, and yet he was a priest of God Most High. So but I think the most important thing that this shows us here is that, and I should have put a space in my notes so I get back to it, is that there is a priesthood outside of Israel. And you can go look at Balaam. There were prophets outside of Israel. So And this priest came 400 to 500 years before the law. If you think about that, it could be as short as 250 to 300 and as much as 500 years before the law, depending upon how you reconcile the time. That's a big deal that there were priests out there. Not only that, we have Psalm 110 verse 4, which says that Jesus Christ is going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So, of course, that's why we see that. That's why this passage is here. But we also see that Abraham was blessed by Melchizedek, and Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek. And those are very important to the discussion that we have here in Hebrews. Back to I'm going to just go ahead and fast forward there. Just ignore the stuff at the bottom. I just want the stuff at the top again. King of Salem. As the verse in Genesis says, Melchizedek is king of Salem. This is most likely a reference to Jerusalem. And Salem was a message, or is the old name for Jerusalem. You can see that in Psalm chapter 76, or Psalm 76, verse 2. And we see that Abraham, when he went out to fight, he probably would have come home this way and passed right by Salem. So it's not called Jerusalem at this point in time. It's called Salem. And it's whether it's a city of the Jebusites at this point in time, like it was in David's time, I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows. But so not only is Melchizedek a priest of God, he's also a king. And this is also going to be very important because Jesus is also a priest and a king. And so Jesus, again, a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and also a king, the King of Kings, as we're told. So we've got Melchizedek as king of Salem. Again, another important point. The next part says, when he met Abraham returning from the slaughter, the kings blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tenth part of all. We've already covered this in our reading from Genesis 14, but if you remember earlier, I mentioned the tithing, and that's actually going to be very important in the next paragraph. But it's interesting, if you go look at commentaries on Genesis chapter 14, you'll say it's not clear who tithes what to whom. In fact, let me go back to that. It says, and he gave him a tithe of all. And they'll say, well, you can't really tell from this text whether Melchizedek gave Abraham a tithe or whether Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe. Well, that's where you go to the sum of God's word is truth, right? The Psalm 110, 160. The Bible's the best commentary you're going to have on the Bible. And this passage makes it clear. It says that Abraham gave a tenth part of all. To whom? To Melchizedek. And in fact, it's important here that the Hebrew writer actually makes a big deal of that not only did Melchizedek bless Abraham, but Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe as priest of God. And so again, that's going to be pretty important. So it's going to be pretty important in the later on in the lesson. It says first being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning of King of Peace. And I could have mentioned this earlier, but Melchizedek literally means King of Righteousness. His name Melchizedek, or Melchizedek, is made up of two words, Malchi or Melchi, and Zedek. And Malchi means king, and Zedek means priest. I believe that's the right way it goes. Melech means king, and Zedek means, I'm sorry, not priest, righteousness. So you've got a person who's Melech, king, Zedek, righteousness. So his name literally means king of righteousness. And because he's king of Salem, and Salem is for the Hebrew word shalom or salam, means peace. So he's literally king of peace. And I think you probably are familiar with a passage that calls Jesus the Prince of Peace, but he's also the King of Peace. So we've got this name first being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace. So how appropriate are these titles? Remember that Jesus is a high priest according to his order, This also confers upon Jesus the same type of titles. Just as Melchizedek is king of righteousness and king of peace, Jesus, as a priest of his order, is also king of righteousness and king of peace. So that's a pretty big deal. So then we get to verse 3. And it says, without father and without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. So this verse is probably the most contested verse of this passage. And this is the first new information we have about Melchizedek. But what does it mean to be without father, without mother, without genealogy? Like I said, some of your translations may say without descent, and the New King James says genealogy. Genealogy could refer to those who come after you, or it could refer to those who come before you. Descent could do the same thing. So I'm just going to stick by using the word genealogy here. What does it mean to be without father, without mother, without genealogy? Let's talk about that first. And I think one could easily rationalize these. But what does it mean, or what does one do with the rest of the verse? Where it says having neither beginning of days or end of life. Made like the Son of God. So that's a little harder to deal with. And as I see it, there are a number of explanations that you could have here. And I think there are three that seem to be best. The first is that he's a regular man whose parentage is unknown. That's probably the most straightforward of these answers. Like I said, I think there are three options that you have here when interpreting this verse. The second is that he's a created being, like an angel, put on earth for the express the purpose of being a type that Jesus could be after. Jesus is a type of this priest. And the third is that he's Jesus Christ himself, manifest in the Old Testament, similar to Joshua 5. So we're going to tackle these three different options here, and I'm going to start in reverse order. Is Melchizedek really Jesus Christ in the Old Testament? If you look at the Old Testament, there's evidence that Jesus appeared at times in the Old Testament in one form or another. They call this a theophany. And a theophany is really just the appearance of God or Jesus in the flesh in the Old Testament. Some believe that the commander of the army of the Lord was one of those. And you can go look at Joshua chapter 5, mainly because he allowed Joshua to worship him. So Joshua approaches this man in Joshua 5. And he actually tells him to take off his shoes, and he bows down and worships him, and he asks him who he is, and he says he's the commander of the army of the Lord. So does that make sense? Is the commander of the army of the Lord Michael or some other angel? I don't think so, because Revelation chapter 19 verse 10 says, and John speaking here, it says, I fell at his feet to worship him, an angel, but he said to me, see that you do not do that. I'm a fellow servant and of your brethren who have the testimony of Jesus, worship God. The angel said, don't worship me, worship God. And so is the commander of the army of the Lord in Joshua 5 an angel? Not according to Revelation chapter 19, verse 10. He isn't. The angels don't allow men to worship them because they worship God. Jesus in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, which I don't have on the screen at all, is called the rock. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So I don't know how that worked, whether Jesus was the angel of the Lord. Sorry, that was supposed to be two. Angel of the Lord. In the Old Testament, oftentimes you'll find that that's capitalized, whether or not he's talking about that's Jesus or not. So the question is Jesus, is Melchizedek a theophany? Is Jesus Christ appearing in the flesh as Melchizedek? And I think the answer is simple or not. I think the answer is simple, and the answer is no. And it's in this verse right here. At the end of this verse, it says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God. If he's made like the Son of God, is he the Son of God? And the answer to that is no. So I believe that we can discount the third option here, that this is not Jesus Christ. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that it would be Jesus Christ being a type for himself. Just like Moses is a type of for Jesus. Moses is a type, and so Moses is a man, but he's a great man. And apparently Melchizedek was also, was he a man or was he an angel? So was Melchizedek a created being? That's, I think, the second option we have here, like an angel. I don't like to say angel, but might as well for the sake of this. There are many encounters between angels and men in the Old Testament. You've got the angel that came to Daniel, or several angels that came to Daniel. You've got the angel that came to Samson's parents. You've got the angel. You've got the angels that came with God when he visited Abraham. So you've got many angels in the Old Testament. The question is, and apparently this angel took up residency in Jerusalem and was, I'm sorry, if he was an angel, this Melchizedek was a resident in Salem, Jerusalem. He was king. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense for God to set up an angel as, not that he couldn't, but doesn't make sense. And I kind of look at that and I kind of shake my head. The Hebrew author actually says that we may encounter angels in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. So angels are all around us. We probably don't see them. And if we saw them, we probably wouldn't know them for being angels. You entertain angels unwittingly. But if this man, or if this Melchizedek was an angel, it would be the only instance that I know of in the Bible where you've got an angel ruling over men like this. And to me, that just doesn't make sense either. God, in the Old Testament, the worship that God allows from man is almost always directed by man. And I can't think of any instance where it's not. So I look at this, if it's not an angel, some other special created being specific for this purpose, again, this would be the only case of this such a being, angel or not. And it's, I don't think it's I think it's out of character for God to do something like this. Well, God may choose his own priests. They've always been men. So I kind of look at that, and again, it leaves us really with the last choice, that this is a man. And so then you've got some pretty fanciful ideas. Well, how is he without father and without mother, without genealogy? So let's talk about that. Without father could mean a number of different things. In fact, it's a common phrase. And we kind of even use this phrase today. When you've got someone who is a nobody, someone might rise to fame and they say, "Oh, that's just he's a nobody." What do they mean by that? They mean that his parents aren't anyone special. his maybe even his kids aren't anyone special. They're not royalty. So in fact, that's it has several meanings. Being without father and without mother, same thing. The first could be that the father was dead or died. Well, not the mother couldn't die before the child was born, but the father could have died before the child was born. That would be without a father. Or his father was dead, or his parents were dead. It could be that the genealogy of the father was not known. In other words, we just don't know who his father was. And so that could be without father, without mother. We don't know who his parents were. And that's not unusual. We don't know who Balaam's parents were. Wait, we might. But I'm trying to think of that. If they call him the son of someone other. They do that, though, right? In the Bible, they'll say that Moses is the son of Amram. They'll say that Joshua is the son of Nun, which is a joke, but we won't go into it. But the fact that they don't name Melchizedek's parents could mean that they don't know them, or well, of course God knew them, but for the purpose of this passage, it's not necessary. It doesn't matter who his parents are, because he was a priest of God Most High, and so and it could mean that the father is unknown. I understand that these three ways are used interchangeably throughout classical literature, Greek and otherwise. To be without a father means that you're of low birth sometimes, that you don't know who the parent is. Father, mother, same thing. But in the case of a Levite priest, that's why I have these on the board. In the case of a Levite priest, lineage is everything. Exodus chapter 27, verse 21 says, "In the tabernacle of meeting, outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall tend it from evening until morning before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to their generations on behalf of the children of Israel." Exodus chapter 28, verse 1 says, "Now take Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me as priest. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar." And so, again, the point you find in the Old Testament, all through the Old Testament and historically, is that the high priesthood depended heavily on genealogy. So when it says without genealogy, it means that Melchizedek's parents aren't known, and it means that he doesn't come from a priestly family. He's simply, God chose him as a priest, and he doesn't have a lineage to give that to it. That's the descent. Genealogy could mean what's coming before you or what comes after you. And apparently Melchizedek stands at a point in time when neither his parents nor his children, his father nor his sons, are priests. He alone is a priest. And that's what that's talking about there. Without genealogy. And we see that for most of the time in the tabernacle and the temples, this was followed. And what I mean by that is that if you start with Aaron and go down, you can actually find you can go Google it, the high priest lineage. So and so was a high priest of so and so. I guess I have a comment coming in. Significant. For fries. I think you mean priests, knowing who their father was significant and necessary for the office period. I think that's Melchizedek. There was no such requirements. Mike, your spelling is or your autocorrect is killing me. No such requirement that he was a priest. Right. So what Mike Franklin is saying, that for a priest, it was necessary to know who your parents were, and that's true. You need to know who your parents were and your children on down, and that's very true. But Melchizedek, being chosen by God to be priest outside of the law, that wasn't a requirement. And really, that's, I think, the point that we're trying to get here, is that there was no such requirement. And I've got some verses here in Hebrews. Let's see. The biggest argument that a Hebrew would give that Jesus was not high priest is that he's not from the stock of Aaron. But the author has already called Jesus, and I went back and looked every time he called him this. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17, a merciful and faithful high priest pertaining to the things of God. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, apostle and high priest of our confession. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14, a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. Hebrews, do I have this one? Nope, I don't. Well, I've got a note to advance my slide. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 5 and 6, that Jesus is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 10, that Jesus is a high priest according to Melchizedek, the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, same thing. What would their main objection be to Jesus being high priest? Is that he wasn't a Levite. And he was the son of David of the tribe of Judah. To them, their genealogy is everything, if you remember that. And so Um, Bill's got a comment on YouTube as well. He says, we know that Aaron was born, and when he died, we do know that. We know his age and everything. And it says none of this is recorded about Melchizedek. And yeah, that's great. Those are great comments. Because it's important to our discussion here, this idea of being without father, without mother, without genealogy. As a man who predated the Levitical priesthood, Melchizedek was under no such requirement to be of the tribe of Levi. It's like, duh, right? The law wasn't given by God until much later, and so this man isn't under the requirements of the law. His lineage is not important. And we know this partly because the Bible doesn't tell us what his lineage is. If Melchizedek's lineage was important, the Bible would have made mention of it. But his lineage isn't important. And that's part of the key to this. There was no need to know who his father was, his mother, or his genealogy. It's not necessary to his function as priest of Most High God. For even though he had no genealogy or parentage, Melchizedek was the priest. I tend to lean towards this last explanation, not Jesus, obviously, because he was made like the Son of God, not a created being. The Bible just, unless Melchizedek is the only example of that, the Bible just doesn't have examples of that. But a man whose genealogy isn't important. And that's really, I think, that what we're getting at here, being without father, without mother, without genealogy. Not important. Now, the question is what does having neither beginning of days nor end of life mean? And I think that some people want to think, well, he's still alive. And I wouldn't put it past God. And it's possible that this man had a fairly long life. But we don't know. And the Bible's the author's making an interesting argument here. It's basically saying that the Bible doesn't say anything about his death. Now, does that mean that he didn't die? Well, all men die, unless he was translated into heaven like Enoch or Elijah. And Elijah was taken up in a fiery chariot. But Enoch was translated. God took him. Maybe God took Melchizedek. The interesting thing is that it says he remains a priest continually. So again, we don't know what happened. Like Bill said, we don't know what happened to Melchizedek. We've got this one passage here, and the idea that Jesus Christ is going to be a high priest forever. Bill says maybe Jesus had no beginning of days, lived before in heaven, and no real end of life, only temporary in the grave for 3 days. So again, we don't know what happened to Melchizedek. But having neither beginning of days nor end of life, if being without father or mother genealogy means that they're unknown, then having neither beginning of days or end of life means something similar. That's the way I look at it. His birth and day of death are a mystery. They're not known to us. The beginning and the end of his priesthood are not known to us. They're also a mystery. It doesn't mean that he wasn't born. If he was a man, he was born. It does not mean that he didn't die, and like I said, unless he was translated or taken into heaven. It's more likely that we just don't know because it's not important for us to know. So, that's the same comment I just read a little bit ago. They're a little bit slower on the screen. Sorry. So, again, I think that this just points to the idea that it's not important. But it does say he's made like the Son of God, and I take this to mean that he was made to resemble the Son of God, not that he was deified or anything like that, but that he was made how he was as high priest and king because Jesus was going to be high priest and king. Does that make sense? That he was made like the Son of God, not that he would, like I said, not that he was deified or made into an angel or anything like that, men are lower than angels, and then when we're going to be higher than angels later. We don't become angels, in other words. But he's made a type of Jesus. And so, or Jesus is a type of Melchizedek, but he's made to resemble what Jesus will become. That's what I'm trying to get out. Jesus is going to become a priest, and he's going to become a king, and Melchizedek was made like what Jesus would become, I guess is the best way I could say it. He's a messianic prophecy. Psalm 110 verse 4 makes this clear. And we see that Melchizedek shows the attributes, king of righteousness, king of peace, that we would see in Jesus Christ. So the only reason I think we see Melchizedek in the text of Genesis and Psalm 110 is to show that one day Jesus will be a different type of high priest. High priest, very unlike those who descended from Aaron. So how is Melchizedek like the king of God, or the son of God? Again, king of righteousness, king of peace, not a genealogical match for the Levitical priesthood, perpetual priest, no account of his beginning or his end, and he was both priest and king. Those are all ways that Melchizedek was made like the Son of God. And so, we see this man, and we get more information about him right here. And I can see in my notes that I just glossed over, remains a priest continually. I have no idea how to explain that, whether or not God took him and he's a priest in heaven, or whether he's still alive. I kind of doubt that. All men are born and all men die. It's a miss, that part. I'm going to just say, as a teacher, I'm sorry. But the Son of God remains a priest continually. How about that? I'll just go on. Let's see. Do I have the next verses? Oh, there's Psalm. Let's look at Psalm 110. I have it on my notes here. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers. In the day of your power and the beauties of holiness, from the womb of the morning, you will have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. We quote the last part of that quite a bit, but the Hebrew writer is going to make a very big deal out of the fact that the Lord has sworn. In other words, he has sworn about Jesus. And how do we know this is talking about the Messiah? Yeah, I think I have it in my notes later. Do I? I don't. This verse is quoted with Jesus when, after the Pharisees have been asking Jesus question after question, and the Sadducees gave it their best shot, Jesus turns around and says, I have a question for you. And he quotes Psalm 110 here. He says, whose son? I do have that in my notes. I know it. Sorry. I'm looking for the actual Matthew 22, verse 41. Then the Pharisees were gathered together. Jesus asked them, saying, who do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said, the son of David. And then Jesus says, well, then how did David said, the Lord said to my Lord? How can the son of David be his Lord? And it actually shut them up. But the point is that they knew that this passage is a messianic passage, and they knew that being a priest according to the order of Melchizedek was something that the priest would do. Sam, I'm not going to answer your question. Jesus remains a priest continually. Actually, Sam said, how does he remain a priest continually? I actually like to think that that's talking about Jesus and not necessarily talking about Melchizedek. But I already said I wasn't going to answer it. So I'll look at that, Sam, and see if I can make a better comment than that. Let's go on. Now, verses 4 through 10, a little bit of a reading here. I've got a note on there. Who was Melchizedek, and what is his significance? It is that he's a forerunner for Jesus Christ in a way that allows Jesus Christ to be priest and king. Jesus Christ brings both of those things together. He brings the priesthood from Melchizedek and the king from David, and so it's very cool. So let's read this, verses 4 through 10. Now consider how great this man was, Melchizedek, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So the author's now going to go deeper into this argument here to show that the priesthood of Jesus is much superior to that of Aaron. And the first thing he's going to show is that the priesthood of Melchizedek is greater than Aaron's. He's going to do that by showing that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek. It's interesting logic that he's got here, but he's basically, and I'm going to do something that I rarely do. And I don't know if you'll appreciate this, but I'm going to summarize this paragraph. The author is continuing his thoughts here. He's saying, look at what great a man he was. He's talking about Melchizedek. Why is he a great man? And again, remember I said it was important that he's the one who blessed Abraham, and Abraham paid tithes to him. And he makes that's his argument in this whole passage here. Even the great patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the spoils. That's how great Melchizedek is. Verse 5 tells us that the Levites and priests received tithes from their brethren as required by the law. And you can look at Numbers chapter 18 if you want, especially verses 21 through 28, and Deuteronomy chapter 14. That's the law of the tithe. Those are both laws of the tithes. And the Levites get their tithes because of the law. And if you go back, there's a reasoning behind that. And that was that they didn't receive land. They received some cities, but they didn't really receive an inheritance of land because God was their inheritance. And so in order to take care of them, in order to take care of the Levites, God provided that a tenth of everyone's harvest, and it was really agriculturally based, was to be given to the Levites and reserved for the poor and stuff like that. Again, that's what's in Numbers chapter 18 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. And again, you can go read those. But the law required that they give tithes. And so verse 5 says, that's what verse 5 is saying, is that as a priesthood, they got tithes by commandment of the law from their brethren. Though they have come from the loins of Abraham, just means that they didn't receive an inheritance. That's what they got. So even though they were descended from Abraham, verse 6 tells us that Melchizedek, he whose genealogy is not derived from Levi, also received tithes, but he received his tithes from Abraham. And not only that, Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and it says in verse 6 that he blessed Abraham, he blessed him who had the promises. So again, how great is this man whose genealogy is not derived from them who received tithes? In other words, he's not a Levite because he blessed Abraham and Abraham gave him tithes. That's how great this man is. Verse 7 makes it clear that the superior, the greater, blesses the inferior or lesser. So it says, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Who blessed whom? Melchizedek blessed Abram. So who's better? Who's greater? Melchizedek is. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. And And he's going to go on. So beyond all contradiction means that no one disagrees with that. So if someone comes up to you and blesses you, they're basically saying that they're better than you are. But in this situation, Abraham received that blessing from Melchizedek, and in doing that, recognized that Melchizedek had the right to bless him. So he was blessed by the greater, being the lesser. So this verse is saying that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. First, because Abraham gave him a tenth of the spoils, and second, because Melchizedek blessed him, not vice versa. Verse 8 is probably the hardest to get our minds around. The first part of verse 8 says, here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, is straightforward. Mortal men being the Levites receive tithes, but but there he is Melchizedek. Is straightforward. The Levites all lived, received tithes, and died. It's pretty clear about that. The second part's a little harder, but like I said, there he who receives him is speaking of Melchizedek, and the context really demands it. The hard part is of whom it is witness that he lives. And it really has to be taken in context of verse 3, I think, that without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days or end of life. This scripture is silent about his parents, his birth, his death. He's only represented as living. Either that, or he's still living at the time the Hebrew writer is writing this, which seems, it's not impossible, it seems far-fetched to me. So I take it in context of verse 3, that he's only represented as living. There's no mention of his death, no mention that he passed his priesthood on to his children, and that is a contrast to the Levitical priests who live and die and pass on their priesthood. It's also a contrast of the priesthood itself. The Levite priesthood is either ended or will soon end. If this was written before 70 AD, which I believe it was, the Levitical priesthood is on its last legs. It will be done when the temple is destroyed. They will go off into captivity, and there will never be a priesthood again. It's interesting, if you go look at the temple project or the tabernacle project right now, they want to build a temple in Israel, and they're not going to have a hereditary high priest. They can't. There's no way to come up with a person who can trace his lineage all the way back to the last high priest. Just no way. So they're going to have to find a high priest. They're going to have to vest one who is not a direct descendant of Aaron. They'll try their best to find one, but they're not going to do it. So even if they do create a tabernacle, they're not going to have a high priest according to the law. Back to verse 8. The priesthood itself, the Levite priesthood has either ended, like I said, or soon would, forever. The priesthood of Melchizedek as high priest is going to be forever. And Jesus Christ, of course, is that high priest. And so we have, Mike Brenneman says, probably not possible for Melchizedek to still be living. I agree with that. That's why I said it seems far-fetched to me. So in verse 8, though, getting to the end of it, let me look and see what it says again. That he lives. That's the question. Again, I take that in context of verse 3, where it says that he has neither father or mother without beginning of days or end of life. Not that means that he's living still, but that I just can't keep my hand away from my face. I apologize. I'm just gonna have to shave this mustache off or something. Sorry, got distracted. But I take verse 8 in context of verse 3. Verses 9 and 10, Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham. That seems like a strange thing, but it says, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So because Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, that means that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham. And that's what verse 9 and 10 are saying. That makes that makes the Melchizedek priesthood greater than the priesthood of Levi, because Levi had to pay tithes. If you go back and look, the people paid tithes to the Levites, and the Levites took and paid tithes to the priests, to Aaron's family. So they got basically 1% of the agricultural output of the nation. That's a big deal. But in this situation, the Levites have a lesser priesthood because Melchizedek was paid tithes by Abraham. That's a summary of those verses there. I hope that's not too fast. Oh, wow, it's already after 8. I didn't realize it was so late. Wow. I was going to summarize the next verses for you too, but that'll have to wait, I think. Sam, I will look up your question, how does he remain a priest continually? Again, I kind of lean towards the idea that this is talking about Jesus Christ, not Melchizedek. But there's enough in this passage that I'm rationalizing, at least for my understanding. So we'll get back to that in a couple of weeks. But I've enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed it too. I know I talk fast. I'm trying to get a lot in, but this is pretty cool stuff. Talking about how Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God, and how Jesus Christ is a priest forever according to his order. And so, again, this is going to be important because Jesus Christ is our high priest, and the Hebrew writer is proving that. And not only is he proving that, he's proving that Jesus Christ is a superior high priest to the priesthood of Aaron. So that's the point of this chapter. We'll get back to it in 2 weeks after. I believe next week, Mike is going to start the book of James. So looking forward to that. He won't be able to get out of that in 2 weeks for sure. So looking forward to it. And I guess we'll talk to you later. Sorry I kept you a little bit over, but thank you for your time.